They were never supposed to be more than a duet. Just two artists, two voices, coming together for a single track. But when Suzi Quatro and Chris Norman recorded Stumblin' In 1978, something happened, something real, something raw, and the world felt it. The chemistry between them wasn't just musical, it was magnetic. Suzi, the fierce, leather-wrapped rock rebel, and Chris, the smooth, emotionally disarming frontman of Smokey, lit up the studio with a connection that couldn't be faked. And from the moment that first note hit the airwaves, fans began asking, what's really going on between them? For over 4 decades, those whispers never went away. Interviews danced around it. Headlines hinted. But Suzi Quatro never said a word, until now. At 75, the woman who built a career on strength, independence, and never backing down is finally ready to speak the truth about what really happened behind the scenes. And what never did. Her voice, now seasoned by time and loss, carries more than just memories. It carries regret, laughter, honesty, and something heartbreakingly unresolved. So, what was the real story behind their famous duet? Why did Suzi stay silent for so long? And what secret was she protecting, not just from the world, but from herself? This is the untold chapter of 2 lives that collided in music, burned quietly in the shadows, and left a mark that time couldn't erase. And now Suzi Quatro is ready to tell it. It was the late 1970s, and Suzi Quatro was already a force to be reckoned with, a trailblazer in leather, shredding bass lines and gender expectations with equal fire. She wasn't just playing rock and roll, she was rock and roll, fiercely independent, unapologetically herself, and proudly immune to the gimmicks and games of the music business. At that same moment, Chris Norman was carving his own path, less rebellion, more melody. As the soft-spoken frontman of Smokey, he was the velvet to her steel, the smoky barroom soul to her raw Detroit fire. On paper, they shouldn't have worked. But when their voices met in the studio to record a song called Stumblin' In, magic unfolded, so intimate, so electric, it left everyone wondering what was real and what was just performance. Neither of them could have expected what would happen next. What started as a simple musical pairing would spark decades of quiet speculation, unspoken feelings, and a connection that neither of them would fully acknowledge until now. The idea came from their producer, Mike Chapman, who had worked closely with both of them and sensed a kind of rare chemistry. He called them opposites, but opposites who, when thrown together, could ignite something unforgettable. And he was right. The first time Suzi and Chris stepped into the studio together, there was no small talk, no awkwardness, just an unspoken familiarity, like they had known each other for lifetimes. When they started singing, everyone in the room stopped. Their voices, his warm, aching timbre and her sharp-edged strength, wrapped around each other like smoke and flame. The lyrics weren't just lines, they meant something. "Our love is alive," sang Chris, his eyes never quite meeting hers. "And so we begin," replied Suzi, her tone steady, but her heart pounding in ways she wouldn't admit, even to herself. That recording session wasn't just a duet. It was a conversation neither of them had ever had the courage to speak aloud. After the song's release in 1978, Stumblin' In became an instant hit, climbing charts in the US, the UK, Germany, and beyond. But for Suzi, it wasn't just another song in her catalog, and the reason had nothing to do with the music. It was about what it awakened in her, a rare, almost frightening vulnerability. She had built her image on being tough, untouchable, but something in Chris's presence, his gentleness, his quiet steadiness, unraveled her carefully built walls. In interviews at the time, she deflected questions about their chemistry with a practiced smile. "We're just friends," she'd say. "He's married, I'm married. We're professionals." But behind closed doors, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Not in a scandalous way, not in a reckless way, but in a deeply human, quietly aching way. There was a tenderness to Chris Norman that made her feel seen, not as the icon, not as the performer, but as the woman underneath. And for Chris, the feeling wasn't one-sided. He later admitted that working with Suzi was like finding a mirror you didn't know you needed. But both were married. Both were loyal, and both were terrified of what might happen if they crossed a line. So they kept it professional. They sang, they smiled, They toured. And then they drifted, never discussing what they had shared in that fleeting studio moment. But it stayed with them. A song, a stare. A silence that said everything. Now at 75, Suzi is finally ready to break that silence. And what she has to say about Chris Norman, decades later, might just explain why she never sang that way with anyone else again. After Stumblin', In stormed the charts and cemented itself as one of the most emotionally resonant duets of its time. Suzi Quatro and Chris Norman were suddenly everywhere, on television sets, in music magazines, on radio stations that played their voices on loop. But behind the public adoration, something far more delicate was unfolding. Distance. Not the kind forged by conflict or resentment, but the kind that grows quietly between two people who know they're standing on dangerous emotional ground. The chemistry that had stunned producers and captivated fans was real, too real. And as the spotlight intensified, both Suzi and Chris retreated into their respective lives, unwilling to risk what couldn't be spoken aloud. Chris returned to his band, his wife, his commitments. Suzi buried herself in work, in family, in the walls she'd learned to rebuild. The emotional tension between them never exploded. It simply dissolved into silence. No arguments, no confessions, just a quiet pact of avoidance that lasted for decades. In interviews, they rarely mentioned each other again. If asked, they praised the song, the collaboration, the moment, but not the person, not the feeling. Suzi, ever the rock soldier, doubled down on her image, strong, solo, unshakable. But when asked in later years about the one collaboration she could never forget, it was always Chris Norman. And the reason why? That answer always came with a pause, a small sigh, a softness in the eyes that told more than any headline ever could. The truth was simple, and yet impossibly complicated. They had connected in a way that frightened them both. In the middle of careers, marriages, expectations, and public scrutiny, they had found in each other a mirror, and had to look away before it reflected too much. The years passed. The song remained a staple on airwaves and in hearts around the world. Fans held on to the hope that they would reunite, if only for a performance. And while they did appear together again a handful of times, most notably on German television specials, the magic, though still flickering, had changed. It was more nostalgic now, more controlled. The glances were still there, but guarded. Time had built barriers around what once felt open and untamed. And still, neither of them truly spoke of what it had meant, until recently. In a rare and deeply personal interview, Suzi Quatro, now 75, reflective, still fierce but gentler with time, finally opened that door. She didn't name names or spill tabloid-worthy secrets. What she did instead was far more powerful. She acknowledged the weight of an unspoken bond. She admitted that there had been something between her and Chris, something they both felt, something they chose not to explore, not out of fear, but out of respect for the lives they were already living. I think we both knew that if we went down that road, we wouldn't come back the same, she said, her voice low but certain. And maybe we didn't need to. Maybe just knowing there was enough. And maybe, in some poetic way, that's what Stumblin' In really was. A snapshot of a moment neither of them could hold on to, but neither of them ever forgot. A frozen flame, a song about love blooming in the wrong season. And perhaps that's why it still moves people. Because it wasn't just written, it was lived. As the world saw only the music, Suzi and Chris carried the silence between the lines. A silence that spoke volumes, and now at last, is beginning to break. As the years passed and the whirlwind of fame began to quiet, Suzi Quatro found herself in a rare position, a rock icon who had survived the storms. She had weathered the highs and lows of the music business, broken through the barricades of gender, and remained unapologetically herself while others softened with age. But beneath that unshakable image, there were still chapters she had never opened, wounds she never quite acknowledged, and emotions that lived in the silence she had chosen decades ago. Chris Norman, though rarely spoken of publicly, never fully left her orbit, not in memory, not in music, and certainly not in the softest corners of her heart. She carried him quietly, the way one carries a beautiful regret, not with pain, but with the ache of a door never opened far enough. And in her later years, as life slowed down and reflection came more often than applause, she began to confront the emotional toll of that silence, the cost of restraint, the cost of never saying what they both must have felt. She's spoken in recent interviews about clarity, about looking back with more compassion than she had at the time. I was protecting everything, my career, his marriage, my own family. But in doing that, I think I buried something real, something that might have changed me forever, for better or worse. It's a stunning admission from a woman who built a reputation on control, on not letting anything or anyone define her. And yet, with Chris, she admits she lost some of that control just for a moment. And maybe that's why she ran. Because to surrender to what she felt in that studio, in that song, in that shared, wordless understanding, might have unraveled everything else she'd built. And so she did what strong people often do. She survived by pretending it never happened, but pretending doesn't mean forgetting. And now, with the lens of time, Suzi sees it all differently. She's not bitter. She doesn't wish things had turned out another way. But she does acknowledge the loneliness of having carried that connection so privately for so long. "There's a part of me that still lights up when I hear that song," she said recently. Not because it was a hit, but because it was true. In that moment, everything was true. It's the kind of confession that hits harder with age, with wisdom, with the knowledge that some things are beautiful because they're unfinished. And maybe that's what Stumblin' In always represented. Not a love story, but a glimpse of one that almost was. A pause in the chaos of life where two souls recognized each other and then walked away. Chris, too, has acknowledged the connection in subtle, respectful ways, never crossing boundaries, never revealing too much, but always speaking of Suzi with a warmth that suggested something deeper than collaboration. In one interview, he simply said, "We made something special. Some things don't need to be explained beyond that." And maybe he's right. Maybe their silence wasn't avoidance, it was protection of each other, of the lives they returned to, of the fragile beauty of a moment untouched by the messiness of reality. But now, at 75, Suzi Quatro is finally saying it out loud. Not for closure, not for headlines, but because truth even this late still matters. And for the first time, she's allowing herself to feel it all, to admit that there was something between them that shaped her, even if it never claimed her. Because some love stories don't need endings. Some are powerful simply because they were real and left unspoken. Now, as Suzi Quatro stands at 75, she is no longer just the trailblazing woman who shattered glass ceilings in rock and roll. She is also a keeper of memories, some loud and thunderous, others quiet and trembling. The world sees the legend, the survivor, the voice that never softened. But behind that legend is a woman who, for a fleeting moment, experienced a connection so personal, so profound, that it still lingers like a whisper in the back of her mind. Chris Norman, with his calm steadiness and understated charm, left a mark that no time or distance could erase. And as Suzi has grown older, she's realized that not all truths are meant to be hidden, not forever. In recent conversations, she speaks about Chris not with regret, but with reverence. "It was a feeling I never expected, and maybe that's why I've never really let it go," she says now, voice soft with age, but unwavering. "It was like holding something precious in my hands, knowing I couldn't keep it, but still feeling grateful I got to touch it at all." That kind of honesty doesn't come easily, not when you've built a lifetime out of resilience. But Suzi Quatro is no longer guarding the silence. She's embracing it, giving it a name, and allowing herself the freedom to admit that even strong women feel things they never say. Looking back, she doesn't wonder what might have been. She doesn't dwell in fantasy. Instead, she sees it as part of her story, a hidden chapter that quietly shaped the woman she became. Stumblin' In is no longer just a song for her. It's a timestamp, a permanent echo of who they were in that moment. Two artists, two souls, colliding just long enough to leave a scar neither wanted to heal. She's performed it countless times since, but she admits that no performance ever matched the feeling of that first recording. No one else could bring that out of her. No one else ever has, and she doesn't think anyone else ever will. That's the thing about certain people. They arrive unexpectedly, stay briefly, and change everything without ever intending to. Chris Norman didn't just sing with her. He saw her. He heard her, not the legend, not the rock star, but the woman behind the bass guitar, who'd spent years being strong for everyone but had, just once, wanted someone to hold her without asking her to lead. And now, in the quiet of reflection, Suzi isn't afraid to let the truth breathe. The connection between them was never about what happened. It was about what didn't. About restraint. About respect. About two people who felt something powerful and chose to protect it by not chasing it. And in some strange, beautiful way, that decision made it eternal. Because had they acted on it, it might have burned out. But by leaving it untouched, they preserved it, frozen in time, raw and glowing like an open flame behind glass. At 75, Suzi has no regrets. She has only truth now. And in speaking it, she offers a reminder that not every love story ends with a kiss. Some end with a song. Some live on in looks, in lyrics, in silences that lasted decades. And now, with the courage that only comes from age and survival, Suzi Quatro finally lets the world hear the story behind the song. The story of a connection that never faded, only waited.